Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. We have a very interesting guest this evening, and I'm anxious to do the show, Secretary Daniel M. French. Mr. Secretary, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Delighted to have you with us. And Ben Kinsley is here as our co-host and co-producer. Secretary French, as you know, is the Secretary of the Agency of Education. Took me a little while to get used to the secretary and agency.
No longer the Department of Education.
No, exactly. Or
the agency
or
of education.
Commissioner was back then. So we always ask people to introduce themselves to our viewers, and you've got quite the background, so we only have an hour, so
okay,
just cut it down a little.
Yeah, so Dan French, Secretary of Education. I was appointed to the position in August of this year. I'm not new to Vermont, a long-serving Vermont educator. I started my career as a high school teacher, high school social studies teacher.
Bless you.
And then I was principal of the Canaan School up in the Northeast Kingdom for 7 years, K through 12 school, and then became the superintendent there for 3 years. Oh. And then I moved down to southern Vermont, so I was superintendent in the Manchester area for 9 years. And then just recently worked at St. Michael's College for 2 years running the graduate program for school leadership. So it's from there that I was appointed secretary.
Excellent.
Yeah.
We're glad you applied for that job.
Thank you.
That was great. I think I read about the whole process and stuff, and it's quite interesting now that you report into the governor and how that all works. It's a little different than it used to be in the past.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Definitely. So as you mentioned, in August of 2018, the governor appointed you to the position of Secretary of Education, and when he did that, he made a statement that you have the expertise to work with districts and local education leaders to recenter the system's focus on expanding opportunities and improving outcomes for kids in a way that is affordable for taxpayers. And I think kind of your background illustrates that a little bit, having worked at all levels of Vermont's education system, both as a teacher and also as an administrator.
Right.
So what kinds of things do you take that to mean when the governor says expanding opportunities and improving outcomes in a way that's affordable for taxpayers?
Yeah. No, it's an ambitious charge, but
absolutely.
I think certainly having perspective on the system as it has been established is useful. It's been a lot of new learning for me. I've never worked inside of state government, so I've been on the job since August. Part of what I had to understand was what is the agency's perspective on the system. Mm-hmm. But I think certainly looking across our state, which is largely, as everyone knows, a rural state, how do we expand learning opportunities for students in the 21st century in a rural state? You know, it's a big question. I think one of the things I've noticed based on my 8 months is that we have a very complex policy-making process in education. So it's positive and it's also negative in that it's positive. We don't have to come up with new ideas. We have plenty of them already on the table. So there's virtually no area of our system that doesn't have a major policy initiative right now. So part of the challenge in terms of getting better coherence or better outcomes, I think, is to get better figuring out how those pieces fall together or come together. Right. So for instance, the governor's vision of having sort of a cradle to career vision, when I came on board, I jumped right into both the early ed side of that, the cradle, and then my colleague Heather Bushy, who's the deputy secretary, her expertise is on the career end of it. So really trying to get policy coherence in those two major areas is is a priority for us both. How do we figure that out? And part of what I've noticed working across the state is that means different things in each region of our state. So it's one thing to talk about policy at the general level, but I think part of the challenge is to figure out, well, what does that mean in Bennington County? What does that mean in Essex County? How do we figure that out on a regional basis? But I think one of the things I'm centering in in the last several months is I think we need to get tighter on how we define quality and how we measure it. Mm-hmm. So I think if we can get clear about how we measure it, and then entrust locals to figure out how to get there, but to be very clear at the state level about how we define quality and how we measure it, I think would be really helpful.
And I think that definition can vary a little bit from one system to another.
Yeah.
Because you have opportunities, for example, in certain parts of the state that you don't have in other parts of the state. So you know, for example, Burlington has access to the Echo Center.
Right.
And, you know, it's maybe not practical to put kids on a bus from
Yeah.
the Northeast Kingdom to drive them to Burlington, but you've got the Montshire Museum,
Yeah.
or you've got other, you know, outdoor nature preserves that...
Fairbanks Museum.
Fairbanks, yeah.
Yeah, it's a
things that you
wonderful,
don't.
wonderful
So there's
facility.
some things like
Yeah.
that, you know, certain parts of the state have access to that other parts of the state may not.
Yeah, and I think we have to attend to what I call inputs, but I think where I'm coming from right now, just, you know, in sort of the early phase of my tenure as secretary, is to get clear on the outputs, you know, because we have, we're about to stand up for the first time our what's called a report card under the Every Student Succeeds Act, so we'll have a new web portal that measures quality. So I think, you know, to start firstly on, well, regardless of what the inputs are, and they do vary on a regional basis, let's get really tight and clear about what the outcome should be.
Right.
So for instance, I think one area where we could probably get tighter on is, you know, our focus on early literacy, you know, so regardless of whether you're in Chittenden County or Essex County, we need to make sure every student is reading on grade level or at a high benchmark level by the end of third grade. I mean, then we can talk about how you do that, but we should be able to establish that across the entire system regardless of the inputs.
This
Right.
conversation leads directly into what the governor said in this announcement a little bit later on, and I'm going to read it. He said he also mentioned the, quote, persistent inequality between
Right.
districts and expanding inefficiencies that divert millions of dollars away from the kids. What is he talking about, persistent inequalities and expanding inefficiencies? That doesn't sound really encouraging.
Well, I think, you know, we come back to our high per pupil costs. I think as what, you know, we've had, it's been really interesting for me as a new secretary to partner with my other heads of agencies.
Yeah.
What I perceived as a perennial issue, or in the last 20 years, the issue in Vermont education of declining enrollment.
Yep.
One of the things I've learned is it's really, declining enrollment is really, like the governor would say, a canary in the coal mine for the larger demographic challenges our state faces. You know, so that's, that issue of, you know, our funding system, in spite of its complexity, is really a simple fraction. In the numerator, we have
Right.
costs. The denominator, we have numbers of pupils. So we've had a pretty precipitous decline in the number of pupils in the denominator of that equation. You know, approximately 30% we've lost since 2008.
Wow.
So at the same time, however, our numerator hasn't gone down. It's, you know, it's stayed pretty high. So we have high per pupil costs. So what we've seen across the state in this time where it's happened, some districts have been able to navigate that okay, meaning they've been able to make investments in their infrastructure, their compensation levels and so forth, whereas others have neglected their school facilities, for instance, have struggled, you know,
Right.
because they just didn't have the ability to do that. So it's pretty clear to me as I travel around, you know, my old neck of the woods in Canaan, when I was there as principal, we had over 300 students in that building. Now there's fewer than 200.
Whoa.
And we also made significant investments in the physical plant. And I left there in, I think, 2004 when I was superintendent. Now the facility needs some care. So, you know, that's a pretty common theme as I travel around. Is in some of the more rural areas, the facilities aren't doing as well,
Right.
and there's fewer number of students. So therefore, some of the offerings are
Is that
not
a
as
hard sell to the public, to the voters and the
yeah,
taxpayers?
yeah. I mean, as your tax rates
Yeah,
gets higher, right? Who
right.
can afford to make those investments?
Exactly.
And we've had a moratorium on school construction aid since about 2007.
Yes, that's right. Oh, I read.
You know,
I forgot
so
about that.
yeah. So I mean, it's been harder for rural areas to make those
Right.
investments. But I think, you know, the challenge in terms of sort of the equity piece, particularly at the high school level, as numbers go down, it's harder and harder to offer an expansive curriculum for kids, you know, so
Right.
it's harder, you know, when I talk to rural high schools, you know, they really struggle with recruiting a foreign language teacher or someone who can teach calculus
That's where
and so
your
forth.
technology comes
Yeah,
should
right,
come
right.
in. I'm a proponent of
Yeah.
that. You are too, are you not?
So it's
Yeah.
really, it's hard to do that
Yeah.
as the number of students decline to offer, let alone the arts, you know, like
Right,
how do you
right.
offer full ensembles and everything. So it's hard,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, we'll fix it.
And
We'll
there's
fix it, won't you?
the other thing too is that that decline across the board is not uniform. It's
Right.
centralized in, you know, certain parts. There are parts of the state that are growing, in fact.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, yeah, we see bubbles in our population, but I think when we look at the broader demographic, virtually every county has suffered, I don't say suffered, the student enrollment parallels a larger demographic challenge in northern New England. So
Right.
virtually all our counties have seen some decline. So when you zoom in on a micro level, you see these bubbles of increases, but the larger demographic trend we're not bucking by any means. You know, in
Right.
northern New England, we're seeing a larger decline, and that's a dynamic we need to figure out as a state in education and all areas of our economy.
Yeah, and it's reflective in a lot of cases of population, broader population changes.
Absolutely.
But birth rates are down too. So it's not just that we have this net negative in-migration, out-migration. It's also that the people that are here are having fewer kids.
Right. Yeah, we say our death rate now exceeds our birth rate for the first time in Vermont since the Civil War.
Yeah. Yeah, and those are difficult demographics to contend with.
Being cheery here.
Right.
No, it's just,
as I get older, I see, the numbers in the obits.
It's a good point. It's not about cheering or being negative. It's just the reality. So we have to embrace that reality.
I'm surprised at this, has Brigham come up in for really saying inequality, because I think the legislature made a mistake in responding to Brigham. The Supreme Court turned it over and said, you decide what's equitable, and they immediately put a dollar amount on it.
Right.
And I think $1 in Burlington, you get less for your money than you do maybe down south somewhere.
I think it's, the very specific focus of Brigham was to say, if you're gonna spend $14,000, this should be your tax rate. So every town that spends $14,000 should have the same tax rate. But the spending isn't equal. I know you bring up Burlington, so when I was teaching at St. Mike's, I used to have my students do some analysis of like teacher salary schedules, and it's easy sometimes to point at rural education as being the problem, but we also have disparate compensation models across the state. So I forget which Chittenden County School District salary schedule it had as its high number over $80,000. A comparable Northeast Kingdom district might have a high of 65, and it took you 35 steps to get to 65, where in the Chittenden County district it only took you 12 or 15. So there's significant compensation differences too across the state.
But there are also cost of living differences between Burlington, especially now. What is it, $1,000 a month for an apartment, a one bedroom?
Yeah,
that'll wake you more than that.
Yeah, more than that.
So tonight we decided, since you came in just when Act 46 was perking up, I think it wasn't in effect since 2015,
It was passed in 2015,
It laid low till you arrived, and here you are. But we're not going to talk about it much tonight, because we would actually like to talk about a concept here, the students.
Oh, okay.
And I'd like to talk about the learning opportunities. Before we do that, I was hoping Ben could give us 3 minutes of where Act 46 is, so we know. And I'm sure, Mr. Secretary, you can jump right in and tell him where he's wrong. But Ben's been following this up with the legislature, so.
Well, thanks for putting me on the spot.
No problem. Anytime.
Yeah, so it passed in 2015, and it had a 4-year window where there's a voluntary phase, which is a 4-year window, and then there's an involuntary phase. And the reason that we've heard so much about it in the news in the last year or so is because we have now gotten to the involuntary phase of that implementation, where all the districts remaining that have not voluntarily merged with someone else to get to a certain threshold in size, or had proved that they had some other kind of restriction that prevented them from merging. They are now in this State Board of Education plan, which you kind of inherited, right? Because the previous secretary drafted the plan, submitted it to
She did a lot
State
of work
Board.
on Act 46.
Absolutely, I think the whole agency did a lot of
Secretary
work.
Holcomb.
Counseling districts.
Yeah, it was a lot of technical work to do.
There's a lot of technical work involved in that. There's some support dollars that went into that too, that the agency had to administer. And the State Board of Education took that plan, made some changes to it. They didn't follow the agency's plan verbatim, and there were some districts that thought that they were going to get an exemption that didn't get an exemption, and some some that just refused to follow the process at all, because they liked the way that they were doing it. And so we've ended up in a situation now where the State Board plan came out in November, and districts have until July 1 of this year, 2019, to merge, or their budgets will effectively they will be forced to merge in a manner where their budgets will be cut by, to a default amount, which I think is 85%.
It's 85% of the,
Yeah, the
of
budgets,
the previous budget.
yeah, the budgets don't get cut per se. You can, under current law, forget about Act 46, but a district that failed to adopt a new budget, district's fiscal year start July 1st.
Right. which
So
is
if
why
you
I cut
if you
off.
didn't have the voters vote budget by that time, you have the ability to borrow up to 87% of the
Oh,
prior year's
okay.
budget.
87, okay,
But it's
yeah.
not like you basically have no budget at that point.
Right,
So
you
there's
don't
no
have a
cut.
budget.
You,
You just have
you can borrow
borrowed
some money, and
Oh.
good news is most districts really don't have significant demands on their budget, their systems until the first payroll in September. So
Right.
the 87% is usually sufficient to motivate people to do stuff. But the problem was with Act 46 is that if you're a new district that's being formed, you didn't have a prior year budget to borrow against.
Right,
So,
exactly.
yeah, it's one of the technical corrections the
Ah, didn't think of
legislature's
that.
taking
Yeah.
up right now.
That's
Yeah.
one of the things that's in
Yeah.
the bill,
Yeah.
Yep.
right? But so it's essentially, it's not that it was part of the.
It's not a cut per se.
It's
just
not a
the-
cut.
yeah.
It's just that if you don't have a budget in place because you're not merged,
Right.
You're going to the default amount, which
Yeah.
is
Yeah. Or like my
87%.
Berlin presented its budget for the year, Berlin's budget, and we voted on that. And then if that 1-year extension doesn't come through and we have to merge, then we go back and vote on the merged budget.
right.
So-
So there's kind of where we are today after November is a group of 33 school districts sued, basically saying that there's a number of complaints about the law. That is being litigated now in Franklin County Superior Court, and will likely be going to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, they even said it in the newspapers.
Yeah.
Even the Judge Mello.
Yes,
said
Judge
it's
Mello.
going.
Yeah, he said it's likely going.
knows.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
constitutional issues that
Yeah.
need to be resolved.
Right.
Right. My favorite was asking Barrytown to put out notice, 30-day notice for an actual vote. And they went in and voted 3 times, and they voted to turn it down. And then the board of directors said, nope, just kidding, you have to merge. I just thought, I don't know, voting in America, you warn it, it's duly warned, but what the heck? That's in the lawsuit, which
Yeah, in which I'm a party of, so I'll
I'm
just,
sorry,
I'll
don't
just,
answer that.
I'll just
Don't answer that.
smile
I
and
just put in my 2
nod,
cents.
and yeah,
Yes,
that's
thank
fine.
you, I forgot.
Yeah. So that's kind of
I have others, you want to hear them? You don't have
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's your nickel, so
I'm
that's,
pretty riled up about this.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that kind of brings us to where we are today. There's a bill that's going through the legislature. It got voted out of the House and the Senate now. They voted 2 different versions of it, so
Right.
it's going to conference committee. The basics of the bill would be to try to give some extension for
Right.
districts that are in that merger plan, give them more
Right.
time to
Right. And only
to work
certain
out some
schools,
of
so
these
not
issues.
all of them, or did they going with all of them this time?
Well, that's one of the
Which-
differences between the House and the Senate
'Cause
versions.
I think that would be more fair. I don't know how you decide from one group to another, so. But anyway, not my
That's-
vote.
It's one of the things that
Yeah.
the House and Senate will have to
Yeah,
work
and
out.
we've covered this, I think, we've had a lot of shows on this.
Oh, really?
Several
From
of them,
different
yeah.
people. I've had David Kelly on,
Oh, okay.
attorney, and we've had representatives from Berlin, from Barrytown, and from, where was up north? Lowell. That was interesting.
Yeah.
'cause
Yeah, they were
theirs was accepted, and
Yeah, North Country Supervisory Union, yeah.
yeah, right, that was very
They have a
interesting.
really large supervisory
Yeah.
too,
Yeah, it's one of the
geographically.
largest, yeah.
They were saying one of their biggest problems if they would be to find busing, because there's no one large bus company here to
No.
cover a whole new area.
Yeah.
And so they'd still be dealing with the small contracts, not that they're all mom and pop, but they're
Right.
close enough. And that would just add to the complexity of it, so, but anyway. He can't answer that. That wasn't a question, that was just a statement on my part.
But if-
So, anyway,
So I mean, some of the things that we're dealing with, as we talked about, is high, high cost per pupil is one of the things that we're dealing with, and one of the things that Act 46 was, supposed to address. Today, we're looking at education spending per student just under $19,000
Right.
on average, but that varies from anywhere from 14,000 to 23,000, depending on the district.
across the
So
state.
it gets to kind of your point about the compliance with Brigham.
Right.
When you have that much disparity in spending levels,
Yeah,
and
I
yes,
don't understand.
everyone who's at everyone spending $14,000,
Right.
regardless of the district, has the same tax
Yeah,
rate.
that's Brigham.
Which is Brigham, but there's this secondary potential issue of the
So what's happening?
disparity
Yeah.
in
Right.
how
Yeah.
much districts are actually
Right.
spending.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
because they said substantially equal, but nobody defined substantially. that could be
Yeah.
anything.
Right.
And they should have spent some time talking about it instead of plunking a dollar number on it. But anyway, back to the kids, because that's what we're here for.
We got Act 46 out of the
we
way.
got that out of the way.
Moving
So
Oh, okay.
go watch some of our former things. We really have covered this a lot, and we've had really good speakers
Yeah.
who have lived it. And
Yeah. And this, this issue from Brigham, I mean, when you go back and look at the Brigham decision, I think it's, when I was teaching this at St. Mike's, I would say more as a spectator. Of course, now I'm in the middle of it, right?
yeah, right.
I had a
Be
chance
careful what you ask for.
had a chance to sort of go back and revisit Brigham. I was teaching a course in school law and finance, and to try to understand Act 46 relative to Brigham, I think. And these are the constitutional issues that are going to be before the Supreme Court now.
Yeah, right.
But part of the logic of Brigham was that to answer this, the first question was is it the state or the locals that's responsible for education?
Right.
And interesting, in the Brigham decision, the locals were arguing the state should be in charge.
Really?
Yeah,
With all their talk about local control?
They were dissatisfied with their ability to afford their education they needed, so they were arguing that the state should be in charge, and the state was arguing the locals should be in charge because the state didn't want to have to pay for it, I suppose,
Act
right?
46 is the reverse of that.
Yeah, so we get back, basically the Supreme Court answered the question in Brigham to say, no, the state's ultimately responsible for education. The state can delegate responsibility over certain elements of the system to locals, but ultimately the states can't delegate its fundamental responsibility. So in many ways, that's the essential constitutional question that'll be visited through the litigation in Act 46.
But I think when you were talking about bringing the policy back to I think they will really welcome that, being involved in the policy making.
Yeah.
Because I don't think they're there now, or if they are, very little. Because we have nobody show up at our school board meetings, and I'm just as much to blame as anybody else.
Yeah, it's challenging. It's we have to figure out. We have to figure out what is local control today in the state. And I was interested in talking with a lot of student groups around Act 46 as I was out visiting, and it was somewhat disheartening that students weren't as fluent in it. I mean, it's always been an interesting observation. I've spent the bulk of my career going to school board meetings.
Bless you.
And it's always interesting to me that we talk a lot about in the state about how important local control is, and when I've seen that work, it's wonderful when it works well. But we do little to train the next generation on how to do that work.
Right.
So we don't teach them how to do Robert's rules, how to participate in those things. So it's sort of left to accident, and I'm always wondering why is that if it's so critical. And I think it is critical, but we have a new generation that needs to be taught how to do local control.
And why it's important, because to Pat's point, there's so few people that show up oftentimes, and that's the most disheartening thing for me is when no one shows up. And you're talking about issues that are central to the two most important thing to families, which is their kids and their money, right? And these are the decisions that are being made at the local level that impact significantly what your property tax rate is going to be, and what kind of education services your kids are going to receive.
But you look at the budget you vote on town meeting day. I don't know what the percentage is, but the majority of it has to do with compensation, which is bargained with the NEA, and you don't have a say in that at all.
Your school board does, though, and
but not a significant one. Can they say they're bargaining?
Well, your school board bargains on your behalf, but the voters don't get to vote on.
So they're a little disheartened.
It's hard.
But you can vote on the deal that the school board arrived to.
Yeah, sure.
There's no real input necessarily unless you go to the meetings, which they don't.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd be interested to know how many people actually read their school budgets before they go vote on on town meetings.
We did a show 2 years ago with Tom Pelham, what questions to ask on town meetings.
That's great.
That was watched by so many people because they sit there and they just don't know what they can ask.
Well, and it's interesting now, particularly under Act 46, it provokes, if you're merging districts, one of the things they have to figure out is whether they're going to vote their budget from the floor or use Australian ballot, right? And so I've been going to meetings the last couple of weeks, and you hear that conversation play out. On the one hand, people are like, "Oh, this is the way we do it from the floor. It's great. You can ask questions." And then, I'll say the newer generation saying, "Look, it's really inconvenient. We've both parents have to work. We don't have time to do this. We would appreciate having an Australian ballot." So it's like, how do you navigate that today? How do you educate people, but also provide them a convenient opportunity to vote?
They changed the law that you can actually talk about the budget at town meeting on the floor, which is brand new last year or two. Because, you know, you have that pre-town meeting day with the usual 50 people show up and the rest don't. They come to vote. So now they can at least get their questions asked.
Right.
But they still have to go vote. And so those who don't have the time just go in and vote.
Yeah.
So
one other thing that I want to highlight before we move on, talking about trends that we see in Vermont school system now. One thing that's policymakers have really keyed in on in the last couple of years is the two things: graduation rate and the continuing education rate.
Right.
So people going from high school to a post-secondary education, whether that's you know, an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, or some other type of training program, a certificate, whatever. And how we increase those rates, because you know, Vermont, I think, is right around average, maybe a little bit below average, I think, for some of those.
We have a high graduation rate, but we're not doing so well on the. You're talking
on
about
the
completion.
continuing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's where we you know, we do well getting kids. You know, maybe we don't send strong enough a message on the career technical education side of it, but we do well getting kids to graduate. Where we don't do a good job is the retaining them at the secondary, post-secondary level.
because they don't have the skills to master it?
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say. I think
they must meet the requirements for college to get in.
Well, that's a whole other question too. You know, it's. But I think part of, you know, and this is part of the problem, because we all have opinions and anecdotes to talk about it, right? But I think you know, the big challenge before all education systems today is how to work from student personal learning aspirations and help students earlier on figure out what they want to do with their lives. And to also, I think, do a better job advertising sort of non-traditional four-year programs as being a viable option for students' careers. And I think we put a little too much emphasis on a traditional four-year degree in the state.
Good for you. I think that we're going to talk about that a little, the flexible pathways, which is great. But when I was deputy, commissioner of education back with David Walt.
Yes.
I realized how many over the years, like every 2 years, the curriculum changed by mandates from the feds. I mean, I came up with 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 different agendas, or 6 different curriculum that they were, the teachers were. It was a brand new thing, and we sent out all kinds of educational things and tried to get. And then, but when will they ever get you something? This is serious. That teachers can apply. And you have maybe 5, 6 years to see if it works. Yeah. I mean, these were changing. It's VELS, Vermont Early Learning Standard, Race to the Top, Common Core, which is what I think is. Are we still doing that?
Yes.
Yes. And then the next General Science Standards, Framework of Standards. I mean, it goes on and on. Yeah. When do the teachers get to say, "This is what I'm teaching"? Yeah. I mean, they must go crazy.
Yeah, I think when I go out and talk with teachers, and I started to coin a phrase, initiative fatigue.
Oh, for sure.
And the first time I said it as secretary, I got a standing ovation. You know?
Did you really?
What are you talking about? Yeah,
but sure, all the teachers in the room knew exactly what you were talking about.
Well, it's easy to get a rise out of people by saying that. The challenge is how do we actually get greater coherence, right? But in our state, and it's important, it's emerged recently. In the interest in ethnic studies, you know, we had a broader conversation about what is the role of the state in curriculum, and what is the role of locals, because we have it set up in our state that the State Board of Education's job is to adopt standards. Right. Okay. And then the locals have flexibility to design curriculum. So we don't promulgate curriculum from the state level, unlike many states. Right. The State Board establishes standards, or just sort of like broad descriptions of what kids should know and be able to do. And then we leave it up to supervisory unions. That was a change that occurred under Act 153. Supervisory unions are responsible for coordinating curriculum among their member districts. Right. So we still have a lot of local control in curriculum. The challenge is, particularly back to the sort of the diverging equity issue, not all districts have the capacity to design curriculum as well as others. Right. So one of my goals as secretary is to really try to work at scaling best practice more rapidly across the state. Right. So if someone has a good idea and a way to do something, let's spread it, as opposed to reinventing the wheel in every single valley and school district in our community. So So that's our model. It's worked out pretty well. As I mentioned, we've had, there's always pressure to adopt new reforms in education, and so far our model is to say, well, the state board does the standards, and then, if the standards are in place, then the locals can consider how to do it.
I was brought up with the 3 R's, and they seem to have succeeded.
Yeah. Well,
I couldn't even help my grandchildren with their arithmetic. They were in the, what is it, the groups of 10. You have to add by 10 and take out 10, and I'm like, oh, forget this.
Well, now
2 times 10 is 20. Give me
we
a break.
we do have computers to do computation today as well.
That's true.
But the issue, the other challenge today is, the standards are not meant, in my view, not meant to be confining of what gets taught in school.
Right.
It's not to say this is what you teach in school. It's to say this is sort of the tagging scheme we can use to offer expanding learning opportunities for kids. Because that's the other challenge for rural districts, is now we can offer all kinds of stuff to kids.
Right.
So it's not just, well, this teacher is what the teacher learned, in college is what the students get taught. It's the teachers now have to be really fluent in designing all kinds of things that can emerge from the internet, from teachers from around the world,
and
so it's
kudos
exciting.
to them for dealing with all different divergent kids.
Yeah.
Some kids with AIDS that stay with them in the classroom all day. I mean, we're really asking them to be social workers too.
Yeah, we have this world of expanding curriculum. You have all different kinds of students in the classroom. It's a complex environment.
Yeah.
Moving ever closer towards individualized learning plans.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I think makes.
So that's how we sort of.
And they're even talking about making career guidance counselors actually do it.
Yeah.
Because for years I think they were more social workers, and you didn't hear about what would you like to do, Johnny, when you grow up. Now they're asking them to actually work with the kids about opportunities. Yeah,
I think that's the big, like I said, the big challenge today is we have all this complexity, but how do we design the system around what the students might need? We still, not to say that it's like whatever you want to do, but one of the reasons we kind of don't see more increasing or higher achievement levels with students is we have to tap into their motivation. Like what do you want to do with your life?
Yeah.
And part of the conversation in education should be around, what do you want to do?
Yeah,
here's a bunch of knowledge we've assembled that other humans before you have found useful, but you need to figure out what your place is in society, and let's help you do that. And if students find more relevance in the work, they'll achieve at higher levels.
And that's a really critical thing. Just knowing, out of my peers growing up, the ones that were really successful were the ones that knew what they wanted to do early on, and were motivated to learn, take certain classes or take certain steps because they knew what they were working towards. And I think that there's this push, and I think you mentioned it, to go to a 4-year school.
Yeah.
And I've always told people that if you don't know exactly what you're working towards, don't take a year or take a little bit of time, figure out what you want to do, and then go do it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't need to be a 4-year. Doesn't need to be a 4-year thing. I did a year at Vermont Tech.
Yeah.
Studying electromechanical engineering.
Yeah.
Before I decided that I didn't like math that much, or at least not calculus that much.
Minor aspect of engineering,
exactly.
Right?
But I learned that, right?
Yeah,
and I went off and got a 4-year degree in something that I actually wanted to do.
Yeah.
Well, now with the Workforce Development Bill, both last year that Bill Botso's committee passed, which we were thrilled with. We just campaigned for Vermont, which I'm involved in. We just put out all kinds of kudos to them. We had Bill on the show. And then this year they're doing follow-up to that bill, and they're talking about tech ed. And now they're talking about combining tech ed with college, going back and forth, that you could actually blend the two and round out your education.
Yeah, I think the trick, if you look at other countries around the world, we have to get some policy coherence in I'll call it the CTE space, the career technical education space. But one of the key ingredients I notice in countries around the world is flexibility. So I think one of the challenges we have in our state is we pigeonhole students into a sort of a track. If you're going to go to the vocational or technical education center, it's really hard for you then to jump back into the regular college environment or vice versa. In a lot of countries those lines get blurred. And there's a lot more flexibility for
True.
students to come in and take a course at a technical center, or to jump back in and take a college course, and to sort of shop around in a sort of a cafeteria approach to curriculum. And right now we're set up in silos, so it's really hard for students to sort of bop back and forth between those things.
And in Europe and those places, I worked for Ciba Geigy, which is headquartered in Basel, Switzerland, and I had a tough job. I used to go over there and interview the graduate students from Tech Ed, and I would bring back kids I hired to work at our laboratories. You would think, I kid you not, they would go nuts. You'd think I'd hired somebody from Harvard or Yale or one of our top schools here, because they knew the quality of the Tech Ed, because my company, Nestle's, Hoffman, LaRoche, and Sandoz, were on the board of directors, and they gave beaucoup bucks to keep that school going. I think we should do that here. Beaucoup bucks from the employers.
While we're on the topic of flexible pathways, so Vermont has 130 independent schools, 8,800 students, grades K through 12. This was actually a lot of discussion around that topic last year in the legislative session.
We did some shows on that too.
Did some shows on that. In addition to that 800 students in independent schools, there's another 2,400 students that are homeschooled or taking some other form of educational classes. It's a system that's been in place since 1869, not 1969, 1869.
First ones, right?
Yeah, first ones in the country to have independent schools. So what does that system offer that's kind of a second layer to what we have in our public education system, and what kind of flexibility the students have moving through that system as opposed to our traditional public schools?
Yeah, it's well, it's an important part of our system. You know, it's as much as we use the term independent, I would just say it's part of the Vermont education system.
Absolutely, I would definitely say that the 4 traditional academies are basically a public high schools.
So when I talk about it, I don't talk about separate systems. It's just how we provide education in the state, and some of it, as you mentioned, the history of it goes back to our rural nature, and in many cases, town academies that were private at the time. It was unusual in the 1800s to have secondary education or high school education be delivered on a sort of a private model. A lot of those institutions then subsequently made the transition to become public high schools. A lot did not, many did not. But it's an important part of our landscape, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to educate students in the rural locations that we do. So. It's important that we maintain, I think, that mixed delivery model. I was a superintendent in Manchester, which is one of the districts at Burn Academy. Yeah. My daughter's a senior this year at Burn. That it's important, when I was a superintendent there, to figure out, I would say, the ecosystem. There was no way that community was going to build a public high school.
Right.
And that independent school in many ways functioned as the town academy, if you will. But it provided students still even there had choice among other schools as well. Certainly the large number of our students in the area attended Burn, but they had choice to go to other places. So what I observed as a superintendent, my job was sort of to make the whole system work, public and private, or public and independent. A couple things start to happen. One is you start to notice that that ecosystem is a real driver, economic driver for the region. So a lot of parents would intentionally choose to come to the region to have that option for the students at the secondary level.
I've heard that a lot about Manchester,
very clear.
St. Johnsbury.
Very clear economic driver. Conversely, on my side as a superintendent, we had to be very aggressive managing residency requirements. So we had, you have some fraud with that, where people aren't really residents who come up, temporarily, or want to have a residence in New Jersey and still take advantage of that. Right. So you have to learn how to manage that. The other thing I noticed is that it was really good for the public education system to have the independent school in its ecosystem, because I won't say a creative tension between the two systems, but we learned a lot from each other.
Right.
And that was really good.
Friendly competition.
It was really good. Well, we didn't have a high school to compete with them, but we picked up on innovations from each other.
Right.
So sometimes they have flexibility, sometimes we actually had more flexibility. So it was really a useful, I thought, a very healthy way to construct a system, but not everyone can do that in our state.
Right, and what I think there's a couple things that are at play there, and viewers should know that students who have public tuitioning dollars can choose to go to an independent school or to another public school.
That's right.
So they can go to either one that they choose,
Right.
and sometimes one is a better fit than the other,
Right.
depending on.
But isn't the
you know.
school choice issue sort of a little tenuous with Act, sorry, I'm going to bring it up,
Yeah.
Act 46? Because I heard some are losing that ability to have school choice, or
Yeah, I mean,
is it going to stay?
The issue really, in the school choice in Vermont exists primarily because districts, it exists at the district level. Districts under Vermont law either have to operate schools or provide tuition dollars for students to get educated. So it's not an option currently under the law not to educate your students.
Right.
Okay, so you do that one of two ways. You either operate a school or you don't. And you can operate a school at some levels and not other levels, meaning you could operate elementary schools but not high schools.
Right.
But that's where the choice begins, is a
Right.
district has to choose what it's going to do. So the challenge under Act 46 is when you bring a new district
Right.
together
All
of
the
different
schools.
types of parts,
Right.
you only can have sort of one pattern of choice in the new district.
Right.
So, if you're going to have high school choice but operate K through 8, that has to be the configuration for every student in that district.
Yeah.
Oh,
So if
I
you
see.
had
so
different,
everyone would have potentially school
if you
choice.
had different configurations
Yeah.
prior to that, you had to come to a common denominator through merging. So in some cases, locals decided, like in one of the mergers in my neck of the woods in Manchester, when they merged the elementary school districts, some had choice 7 through 12 and some had choice 9 through 12. In order to come together and preserve 9 through 12 choice, the small districts that had 7 and 8 choice decided to give that up.
I honestly don't think people understand this.
Yeah, I know.
They really
Yeah.
don't.
And
'cause
This
I'm
is where it
hearing-
starts getting complex.
Yeah, because
And conversely,
that's not
some
what I've heard from talking to
some
people.
districts through merging decided to stop operating and expand
Right.
choice. So it's that point of coming to the common denominator. So
Right.
Act 46
It's
is
so
sort of
complicated.
sort of benign on the topic,
Yeah,
but
it's-
it does force neighbors to come together and come to a common enrollment
I would
pattern.
say it was a mixed bag. Like
Yeah.
there were some that gained additional
and
grade
some
levels,
lost.
some that lost.
Yeah.
and-
Yeah.
But people honestly do not
probably net
understand
zero.
what you just said.
Yeah, I know.
Really.
Yeah.
I know.
And
It's complicated. Really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
your
yeah,
eyes
right.
glaze over like the old deer in headlights. Like what?
One of the things I think that's interesting about this system, and we do have to some degree universal high school choice.
Yeah, we have
It's a little complicated
Yeah.
because it doesn't work quite the same way. Like the receiving district has to agree to receive the student as opposed to
Right.
here's the check, you have to take them. But what I think is interesting about it is, you could have someone who lives in one town that maybe does operate a school, but parents live in another town, right?
Right.
So it's actually easier, and it could be potentially easier to have that student go to a school in the town the parents work in,
Right.
and that may work better for the family. Or, one school has a great arts program, one has a great basketball program,
Right.
and one kid wants to go to the school that has a really cool arts
Right.
program, and the other student wants to go to the school with the cool basketball
Right.
program, and that's what these districts allow you to do, assuming that everything works out.
David Kelly was telling us that somebody in his town, I think it's Calais, wanted to go somewhere out in California. Remember that? And
It was an art school, I think.
An art school, and they sent her.
Yeah, I mean,
I mean,
the way
obviously they
Vermont
have a-
law is set up, if you don't operate a school, meaning you had school choice at
Right.
that point, the district is liable to pay tuition wherever you want to
Wherever.
go, as long as it's a non-sectarian school, can't be a religious school, and the school has to have an approved curriculum.
And
So-
apparently she's just
Yeah.
blossoming and doing
Yeah, I
great,
mean, so you get two things there. One is not everyone has the same choices, so
Yeah.
you worry about that.
Right.
But on the other hand, in the era of particularly technology, we start thinking about expanding learning opportunities for kids. I tend to err on the side of taking down barriers to student access.
right.
So I think we have too many micro barriers. It's sort of back to the CTE question. We have too many micro barriers in our system that just arbitrarily prevent students
Right.
from accessing different things. I think one of the things we see with technology is that we need to break down those barriers, and that
That's
means
good.
getting rid of some of these structural limitations for students to follow their passions and interests.
We didn't talk about homeschool, and I'm just
Yeah.
curious. I have the stat I have is 2,384 students. Is that up or down?
I think that's approximately what we
same?
have, yeah.
And who oversees that? Do they report into the department? But is there somebody that oversees what's happening out there?
No,
There
you
used to
say
be.
oversee, yeah, the department or the agency, we approve their setting the program up,
Yeah.
but that's pretty much it. Once
Because
they're approved, it's really up to the parent.
Back when I was there,
Yeah.
they had a contract with a woman who was in charge of all the adult ed teachers and what they were doing, and she would report into the commissioner. And because a lot of it can be done right online. I mean, you can just send in your assessments and all the reports.
A lot of the parents do that.
Yeah.
But no, we don't really, I would say, we oversee sort of the application process.
Right.
You have to set up a program and conforming with state law, but absent that, we don't monitor the outcomes of students.
Is there a way to know if the kids are learning what the public school kids are learning? Or
yeah, there isn't a lot of monitoring on our end to do that, but the parents I know who home study really work hard to make sure.
They gotta be dedicated.
Yeah, it's a lot of work, and they make sure that the students are, are being well educated. And
Right.
as a superintendent, I've seen those students enter back sometimes into the public education system, so we work on that piece as well.
Yeah,
so.
that must be a hard transition.
No,
just
it's
because they're used to being home with
we
mom
want to
and
figure
dad.
out where they are,
Yeah.
curriculum-wise. That's where more of it's at. It's like, well, what do you need, and how are you going to meet graduation requirements?
Well, a lot of home study students either re-enter the education system in high school or in college.
Right.
You know, and everyone has to take an SAT or an ACT. So
Yeah, that'll equal it out, right?
Everyone's held to that standard at a
Well, I think,
point.
and they're able to participate, homeschoolers, to participate in activities, of sports activities and stuff in the public schools, so they have some kind of assimilation with kids their own age, are they not?
Yeah, I mean, each school district is required under Vermont law to have a home study policy that describes how that will work.
Great.
So schools have the ability to say, well, you can't jump out and disrupt the school routine, but for the most part, those parents do have the opportunity.
I would think for the kid, just to be, socialization is key for being successful.
They have the opportunity and the right to participate in those programs.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should talk about flexible pathways. I'm watching the time because I got to get my Act 1 question in. Otherwise, I can't go back to Prevent Child Abuse Vermont. There was a lot of talk about flexible pathways, and it talks early college, work-based learning, career tech centers, dual enrollment, and personalized learning, which I think sounds like a shift, and I'm excited about it because it's good to hear.
Yeah, I think so. And Vermont has an ambitious policy around that. Once again, it's about breaking down barriers. It's Act 77.
Yeah.
Act 77 has three components. The idea was to do all three at the same time. So we have flexible pathways, the idea that students should be able to move through like a high school curriculum in lots of different ways. Personal learning plans. That there should be a plan that sort of students map out, once again, trying to get more intentional about what they want to do with the rest of their life. And then proficiency-based learning, the idea that students should be able to demonstrate competency.
And they participate in this discussion, so they must buy into it and be fairly committed to it.
The challenge is it's been, we haven't, in my view, the agency struggles to support that. When it initially came out, as sort of the idea was you have to do all three of those things to make it work. It's hard to do proficiency-based learning or flexible pathways if you don't have personalized learning plans, and vice versa.
Yeah. So has every school bought into this?
No, I mean they've struggled because
it's a talent to help kids.
It's really hard to implement. So when I go around the state, I see very unequal implementation of this. So folks who have really focused on proficiency-based learning, for instance, but have neglected personalized learning plans, or vice versa. So I think it's an issue. I want to sort of back up and take stock of and see what we can do to support people to do it. I don't want to back away from our commitment to do it because I think it's the right thing to do. It sounds like the right thing to do with kids.
Yeah.
We just, policy-wise, conceptually, we haven't provided enough support around how to do that. But we have some people that are doing really good jobs with it, and we have other people that are really struggling.
Well, I know we talked before, that's the old-fashioned guidance counselor, and I'm not critiquing what they've had to do. It's not their fault. They've had to become social workers with most of these kids, so not too much time for good old-fashioned guidance counseling.
Yeah, it's an important component. School counseling is an important job.
And that's a skill in itself, to be able to drag out of the kid what would be best for them.
What they want to do.
Yeah. I don't know.
We should talk about Bully No More.
Yes, we should
get to
talk
your
about
Act 1 question.
Yes.
So we did a show a month or two ago.
It's being loaded now.
Exactly. It's been in editing for a while. But it's called Bully No More. It's a musical about bullying, which has 18 songs, many of which were written by John Gilmore, so kind of one of our local Vermont heroes.
Yes, the secretary knows all about him, right?
Yes, thank you.
But the idea is through a play, to teach kids about bullying and how to handle bullying and how to what not to do, as well as what to do if you're the one being bullied. Right. Where do you see? We love the show,
yeah, really,
but what do you? How do you see this playing into, or at least this theme playing into, Vermont's education system?
Yeah, I would firstly thank you for sponsoring that.
Oh, I have to thank you because you just said sure. I asked you to do the intro, and yeah, sure.
It's important that we, Vermont, when you get into, and I think I'll just say from an economic standpoint, firstly, in an era of declining enrollment or declining population, we need every Vermonter. We need to be able to harness every single person's capacity on behalf of our state. But bottom line, it's just morally the right thing to do. I mean, it's our education system, just like our society, needs to be open to whoever students are and whoever people are. And if we don't prepare for that, and what will no doubt be an increasingly diverse society, our students will not be well equipped to survive. So it's important that we start that day one in schools as sort of, this is an accepting, tolerant place, because, you can't, it's hard to learn otherwise. Yeah. So whatever we can do to support that message.
And I know you gave a great presentation that I heard, and you were talking about how wonderful technology is, but technology used for this purpose is pretty damaging to the kids.
In many cases,
can't run away from it.
Technology is sort of, I would say, it's not good or bad. It just tends to shine a light on things, and it's in this case, it can shine a light on some of the bad parts of human nature. So we need to be present in technology as educators and as community members to ensure that technology is used appropriately.
Because I think the written word over those social is more cutting than talking to somebody in person, where you see their body language and you know what they mean, instead of typing out something evil.
There's things that people would say,
that they wouldn't say in your face.
Even adults. I mean, it's amazing. You scroll through Twitter and look at some of the comments, things that people say. Directly, not even indirectly, but directly to someone else.
Right to the jugular.
And
it's pretty bad.
It's like I would never ever think about saying that to someone's face. And I can't imagine that they would even say that to someone's face.
It's important that we get it right. I mean, especially for a rural state, we're gonna rely on technology quite a bit, I expect, to offer expanded learning opportunities for kids, but we can't afford it to also undermine our civic ethics and commitment to inclusive society.
Well, let me talk about Act
we'll
One.
Give you your question.
Linda Johnson and just so I've said this before, I'm on the board of directors of Prevent Child Abuse Vermont. And I'm actually working over there a couple hours a day because they lost one of their staff, so I can type, so I'm over there working. There's a thing called Act One, and Prevent Child Abuse Vermont had a huge conference with so many sponsors. I mean, everybody, Agency of Education, everybody supported this conference, and it was well attended. And Act One is intended to ensure that teachers, parents, and students get trained with age-appropriate materials so they understand what is abuse and try to figure out a way to prevent child abuse. And I think I think we have about 75% of the schools are working with Prevent Child Abuse Vermont or some other. There's so many others that are out there, but I think that's important to help kids get through all this.
Yeah, and I really appreciated the conference and the opportunity to highlight the issue. I know the sponsors really worked hard on that, because that's sort of, as we were talking earlier about the complexity of everything that everyone's got on their plate today. But the bottom line is schools need to be safe, and teachers and educators play an important role in ensuring that safety. So we have to constantly be reminded of that. It's not like like mission accomplished, I've had the training and now I'm all set. It has to be put back on the front burner.
Because I would think if kids are sitting in a class afraid of the kid next to her or him or something, they don't pay attention. Their mind is somewhere else on their own safety.
We need to stay, keeping that in the forefront of our minds. And
how are you tackling all this with bullying, harassment, and child abuse? I mean, that's and if they have it at home and come to school, the teachers have to be taught how to identify that there's a real problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's the agency's role is to sort of coordinate and convene those conversations around it. But we have, I think from a policy perspective, increasingly we'll be talking about integrated service delivery model. We work closely with AHS, our department's Agency of Human Services. That work was started by my predecessor and Secretary Gobet at AHS.
Yeah.
But I think that's what the future is going to look more of, is the
To have
agencies.
social workers or somebody
The
there
agencies
at
have to be very tightly integrated.
Yeah.
And once again, in my experience around the state, there are places where that already happens, and there's places where, in some of the more rural spots of the state, where there isn't as good integration. So I'd like to really explore that as a Secretary of Education, is how we can work better together to really create an integrated delivery model for
things kids
services.
have to deal with these days.
Yeah.
I honestly don't remember it, and I know I'm very old, and I do remember
Yeah.
back, but we just didn't deal with those things. We didn't.
Yeah.
I used to walk home by myself because it was a fairly populated area, and everybody knew me. So they watch, they call my mother, she's here, she's
Yeah.
going. But so it was a different community
Yeah.
back then. There was a community, and
Right.
they were watching out for you.
Yeah,
And if you messed up, mom got a call. You know.
right.
Yeah.
Call your daughter home, she's doing X or something.
Yeah, I don't think people do that anymore.
No, they don't, or they
Yeah.
whistle,
Or-
and,
yeah,
and everybody in
exactly.
the community said, Patty, your dad's calling you, so
Yeah.
home you went. But it
Yeah.
was scary.
I do think there's some opportunities there, though, particularly for rural districts. When you're talking about the decreasing enrollment, there's more capacity in school buildings, right?
Right.
And I think that creates opportunities to put social workers, AHS staff in school buildings, like physically in the building, because some of that space may be available, particularly in schools that are losing population.
Yeah, we have infrastructure, right?
Mhm.
And I think it is, it's critical, if we try to distill back to the complexity issue, and we try to distill that down from the state level to get really tight on some simple things. I'd go back to the idea of early literacy, making that a focus of what we try to achieve in Vermont, because if we can do that, the assumptions are, in order to get students reading at high levels, that means that their safety is taken care of, that other things are in place to do that, their health
Right.
is really good. So that allows us to focus our infrastructure. So I think it's going to be really important that there are learning centers, I'll call them, in every community, more or less, pre-K or whatever that looks like, through, fourth grade. I think where we're going to have to spend some time thinking about is when we get to the middle level, and we're going to have to start thinking about regionalizing our middle level programs, because I worry now, back to the equity issue, when we go around and see very small K-8 schools, and there's only 20 students in the middle
Oh.
school, how do you begin to
Yeah.
offer what those students need in,
Right.
in the 21st century? But I think we can make a really strong argument for why we need to have early learning centers in each community. I think there's probably going to be more regionalization at the middle level as we seek to offer those students everything they should have, and especially in terms of the arts. And then really start to stand up, our regional high school flagship centers of 21st century learning, and how that partners with CTE and so forth.
Absolutely.
So we're just going to have to figure out that model as a state and make some hard decisions about how to get there.
Totally. So we've got about a minute left. At the beginning of the show, you mentioned almost every part of your agency is involved in some sort of...
Yeah, right. We have
uh,
policies in every area.
Yeah, exactly. Some sort of reform in every
Yeah.
area. Are there any that we haven't touched on tonight that Vermonters should be aware of?
Yeah, I think tangentially, we were just talking about early education, which I think is a big policy area that we're going to have more activity in. We have a policy now, Act 166, which is admirable in many ways, but I don't think we've finalized how we're going to deal with this issue in terms of the integration of early learning and care. And I know I spend increasingly more time out talking with early care providers. I was out at a conversation out in Bradford one evening talking to a regional group, and they were talking about how they were struggling with complying with what, from their perspective, were overly complex state regulations.
Right.
And some of them
Shock.
have basically been put out of business because of that.
Right.
So we can't afford in rural areas like Bradford for that to happen as much as we might want to increase the quality. So I think early learning and care is an area where we're going to have to probably embark more sooner rather than later in an integrated delivery model and figure out how to get better investments and efficiencies out of that area.
And this is one of those areas, too, that's shared stewardship between your agency and
Right.
the Agency
Right.
of Human Services, right?
I get a sense everybody is, I don't know what's happened, but everybody seems to be working together in Human Services, Department of Labor, Education. I think there's something's happened, which I'm thrilled about.
Yeah, we have a good beginning of a relationship. I think we
great.
need to really advance that to the next level because that's sort of a frustration for folks in the field is when they feel like they're being caught between one agency or the other.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Keep up
if
the
that
good work.
infighting's going on, we need to smooth those things out.
Mr. Secretary, we've run out of time. We're very glad you're here. It goes
Thank you.
fast. Ben, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you all for listening in, and remember, just keep listening beyond the sound bites.